The rivalry between the Imperial Japanese Navy and the Imperial Japanese Army is something of a legend, with its origins said to lie in many causes, everything from the normal rivalry between different branches of the armed forces for limited funding, through the highly political roles that the heads of the two services had in the interwar Japanese government that lent an extra layer of governmental political power struggle to their jostling. Also, the fact that the Imperial Japanese Army saw Japan's future as being on the mainland of Asia, whilst the Imperial Japanese Navy saw an overseas colonial empire, with the result that the two were quite literally advocating for Japan to move in two completely opposite directions. And, of course, the fact that the two services' senior staff were reputed to be largely made up of the descendants of two rival samurai clans who absolutely hated each other with a feud going back centuries. And all of this resulted not only in both services running their own separate air forces, largely using completely different and incompatible aircraft, and having equipment that was manufactured in the same factories but to completely different specifications, and even with physical barriers put up between the two lines, both sides flat out lying to each other about what they'd actually achieved in recent combat, which often ended up being to both their detriments, and even full-on assassination attempts against the other services' officers, albeit that the occasional assassination attempt within the two organisations wasn't unknown either. In short, they were rivals in everything up to, but not quite, including having a ritual katana duel to the death whenever officers of the two services actually met. It also meant that both the Army and the Navy had their own tanks and their own amphibious troops. And of course, since cooperation with the Navy was fractious at the best of times, this also meant that the Japanese Army felt they needed to have a navy of their own. These ships are what we'll look at today, starting with a little bit of an odd one, even in this generally odd collection. The Shinshu Meru was a crane ship of about 2,000 tons, relatively slow, not exactly a frontline combat vessel, but her purpose, despite being an army vessel, was entirely naval-related. The crane was specifically designed to be able to dismount and relocate battleship guns and turrets, and despite what they might have wished, the Imperial Japanese Army never actually possessed any battleships, so its only use of any great purpose was to interact with the Navy. Whilst she'd been built just after World War I and saw a happy interwar life ferrying bits of decommissioned 12-inch battleships around, followed by the turrets of Japan's abortive 16-inch ships, which had been cancelled by the Washington Naval Treaty, she'd spend the war itself wandering around the Western Pacific lifting things, with one notable side mission. She was sent to look for and potentially, as far as reports can be determined, conduct some minor salvage work on the wrecks of HMS Repulse and Prince of Wales in the aftermath of their sinking, with the theory going they were probably trying to recover the radar sets. Slightly bizarre crane ship aside, let's work our way approximately upwards in terms of size. A large amount of the Japanese Army's fleet was centred around amphibious operations, unsurprisingly, and it was surprisingly well developed, to the point that, at least in terms of all-round capabilities on paper, the Japanese possessed the most advanced amphibious fleet in the world at the start of the war. This started out at the lower end with two armed and armoured landing craft, the 10-metre or 35-foot Type B Shohatsu class landing craft. This was a simple, shallow draft craft that could hold 30 to 35 men, and was designed to be carried either on smaller ships or in large numbers on larger ones, and the 14-metre or 47-foot Type A Daihatsu landing craft, which came with a bow ramp and the capacity for up to 100 men or a light tank. Of course, the Imperial Japanese Navy being the Imperial Japanese Navy, they went on to order the Toku Daihatsu 17-metre craft during World War II, which ostensibly allowed you to carry two light tanks or a single medium tank, but which I suspect was made in large part just to get one over on the Imperial Japanese Army, which would then have to make do with the smaller, inferior craft. A couple of other related landing craft in this size range were also developed, largely following the same vein as the two primary types, but you get the general idea. Putting a surprising amount of thought into the idea of amphibious landings for the late 1920s and early 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Army had realised that landing craft on their own, even armed with machine guns as they were, might be easy targets, and so they invested in a series of protected gunboats to offer close-in fire support and escort during landings, as well as to patrol the area in the aftermath. The initial Sukutai class were designed to be carried alongside the other landing craft, but were a little bit larger, faster, and could of course carry considerably more firepower. Normally a 57mm gun, taken of course from a tank, alongside machine guns and smoke generators. Armour wasn't great, it was only 6mm thick, but that was enough to protect the crew and the interior from long-range rifle and machine gun fire. Protection against anything larger would have made the vessel too heavy to carry on the normal davits and too deep a draft for coastal operations. This particular class came in about half a dozen sizes, including one variant that doubled the heavy gun armament by adding a second 57mm weapon. In the event, though, their more common use as the war went on was as improvised escorts to small supply convoys, which typically consisted of various landing craft loaded with supplies and sent out in lieu of the larger transports, which would normally have destroyer escorts, mostly on the ground that Japan was fast running out of the bigger ships. A slightly smaller type with a single 37mm gun was also developed for purely riverine patrol work and would be largely confined to this role since its diminutive status made it somewhat unsuitable even for the aforementioned scratch supply convoys. Recon and messenger boats in the same size category of 10 to 15 metres were also built to assist with the landings, and all of this centred around the world's first purpose-built and dedicated amphibious assault ship, the Shinshu Meru. This vessel had everything. It could carry dozens of landing craft of all the above types. It had a well deck where loaded craft could be floated out. Although for speed, the boat davits could also launch craft down either side if necessary. And in theory, it could even carry a number of aircraft, launched by catapult and then either recovering onto land or possibly by crane, depending on if they were wheeled or float planes. Plus, all of the vehicles aboard could deploy straight from the ship via specially designed ramps if a suitable pier was captured and the ship could come alongside. The only downside was that on just over 7,000 tons displacement when unloaded, the aircraft and their supplies would have made the ship far too crowded, and so the vessel never actually carried any. But that was fine, as what was to have been the hangar space and the area for the catapults was simply stocked with more men, supplies and vehicles. Since the catapult launch idea didn't quite work out, the next iteration, the Akitsu Maru, instead had a full-length flight deck. Although sometimes called an escort carrier, she wasn't actually built for this purpose. She was adapted from a liner under construction and intended to function as an improved version on the Shinshu Meru type, able to operate conventional aircraft with good short takeoff and landing characteristics, and still carrying almost 3 dozen landing craft and their occupants, with a small air group operational up top, and more capacity to be used as an aircraft ferry to send land-based aircraft ashore if she didn't have to recover them back. In normal operations, she would expect to carry an air group of around 8, but as a ferry, she could carry up to 30. The principles that these two ships embodied can be seen today in modern amphibious assault ships. Indeed, the Akitsu Meru, from certain angles, looks very similar to a modern amphibious assault vessel. Both vessels would be sunk by US submarines towards the end of World War II, although both were torpedoed at least once beforehand, with Shinshu Meru being one of the victims of Megami's spectacular own goal in the Battle of the Sunda Strait, although she was refloated, thus joining the rather exclusive club of ships that have been sunk more than once. Another vessel similar to Akitsu Meru, the Nigitsu Meru, would also be built, but somewhat later and only thus completed during the war. It was also sunk by US submarines after just over 9 months of service. In the intervening time, the Imperial Japanese Army had turned to looking for an intermediate vessel, larger and thus more ocean-going than a Daihatsu, but not as large and complex and heavy on investment as their assault ships, which ranged from 7 to 10,000 tons. This Koryu, or general-purpose vessel, was primarily designed to transport multiple vehicles, and testing began on a series of prototypes called SS number 1, number 2, etc., etc. These showed that a relatively larger vessel in this size range was better, probably something just over 1,000 tons. But at this point the Imperial Japanese Navy stepped in, claiming that such a vessel, which was roughly analogous to the later Allied Landing Craft Tank, or LCT, would be useful for them as well. And since the Japanese Navy controlled the shipyards, the 800-ton Type 101, or Number 101, depending on which source you listen to, landing craft were built in numbers, instead of the SS class, which was limited to a smaller production run. The 101s at the 800-ton margin were somewhat smaller than what the Army had actually wanted, and indeed the Navy ended up taking more than two-thirds of the production run anyway. Although the Navy ended up losing over 80% of theirs, whilst the Army only lost a single vessel. In part, one suspects that the Imperial Japanese Army design was just a little too close in size to the Imperial Japanese Navy Number 1 type amphibious transport class. At the start of the war, the Imperial Japanese Army also requisitioned a pair of transports, Taikai Maru and Kashi Meru, for use as communications vessels. Extensively outfitted with radios, they both spent a couple of years used to relay signals across parts of the Pacific and Indian Oceans, but were fairly rapidly reverted to use as regular transports, mostly for troops and their associated supplies, due to the losses in normal transport units, with both being sunk by air attack in this role in separate incidents towards the end of 1944. There were also 5 aircraft and vehicle repair ships, again all requisitioned at the start of the war, designed to provide frontline maintenance support to Imperial Japanese Army units that were either freshly arrived or on stations in areas that had too small a garrison to have all the needed parts and machinery on hand themselves. However, as with the communication ships, they would find themselves pressed into transport duties by the mid-war period, with all 5 vessels lost to US submarines, except for one, which was sunk by air attack instead. One of them was sunk in 1942 by submarine, and all the rest were sunk in 1944. 5 underwater cable-laying ships also fell under the Army's purview. These were actually quite important, as physical communications lines meant information and conversations could be transmitted from Japan to holdings like Hong Kong and Singapore without any chance of Allied signal interception, and thus decoding, which preserved operational secrecy for the Imperial Japanese Army. These cables would come under sustained Allied attack later in the war, especially by X-craft, specifically to force the Japanese to use radio. Due to their much more limited and much more interior role, 3 of the ships would actually survive into 1945, and one of them survived the war itself, the other 2 falling victim to a navigational error and US aircraft respectively, whilst Allied submarines had taken the other 2 earlier in the war. The Imperial Japanese Army also operated a large fleet of general transport vessels, tankers and hospital ships, one of the latter amusingly named the America Maru. This is perhaps the least surprising aspect, as pretty much every army in the war had its own collection of troop transports and associated supply vessels, and in the Imperial Japanese Army's case, many were simply taken up from trade, seized prizes, or similar, although there were a few purpose-built for military life that were available right at the outset. With the outbreak of war, lessons began to rapidly be learned, and one of the first was just how vulnerable transports were to attack aircraft. Japanese anti-aircraft firepower wasn't especially brilliant at the best of times, and having what anti-aircraft weaponry did exist, being largely on escorts, which were 1, often involved in their own fights for survival, and 2, belonged to the Japanese Navy, meant that a number of transports were therefore designated Boku Kinkansen, or Bokusen for short. By virtue of being Imperial Japanese Army ships, they avoided, at least for this period, the 25mm anti-aircraft gun of the Imperial Japanese Navy, instead having a number of Imperial Japanese Army pattern 75mm or 3-inch and 20mm guns installed. with the idea of these ships forming a kind of self-escorting element for the transport convoys. However, within a year it became clear that pretty much anything that floated needed as much anti-aircraft firepower as could be fielded, and the Bokusen were no longer special, except perhaps in having a slightly higher anti-aircraft gun count than the average transport. These ships, incidentally, were named the Zenyo Meru, Sakura Meru, Sado Meru, Yasukawa Meru, Hirokawa Meru, Aobasan Meru, Atsutansan Meru, I think, and Arizona Meru. Recognizing that they'd been onto a good thing with their initial assault ship idea, the Imperial Japanese Army quickly started converting other cargo ships during the early part of the war into further such assault vessels, with 6 more ships completed during the war and 1 finished afterwards and then converted straight back into civilian life. Unsurprisingly, most of these did not last out the war. Takatsu Meru, Mayasan Meru, and Tamatsu Meru were all sunk. Kibitsu Meru and Hyuga Meru took fatal damage from mines but managed to run ashore, with Setsu Meru being the only one to actually make it through intact, being converted post-war into a whaler, which the incomplete vessel, Takitsu Meru, had also become. Gratifyingly, I'm happy to report both of those vessels sprang leaks and sank into the Antarctic waters in the early 1950s. This brings us to the last major class of Imperial Japanese Army warships, actual escort carriers. These came about generally towards the end of World War II, with the Imperial Japanese Navy losing ships like they were running some kind of giant, very explosive insurance scam, and US submarines populating the waters near Japanese home islands in numbers that probably felt a little bit like the seagull scene from Finding Nemo. The Imperial Japanese Army decided that if it wanted at least some of its ships to stay afloat for any length of time, they needed to provide anti-submarine warfare air cover to their convoys, and they'd have to do it themselves. This would consist of a number of tankers that were converted into small carriers and one odd hybrid, the Kumano Maru, which started life as a cargo ship, was taken over during construction to become the last of the assault transports, but by this point, with no landings to undertake, she would have been used as some form of aircraft transportation vessel, as she had a through flight deck, if she'd been utilised in any way in the 4.5 months between her commission and her capture in 1945. The tanker conversions didn't really fare any better. Yamashio Maru was the only completed one of her run of 3 tankers, and was one of the shortest-lived warships of all time, commissioning at the end of January 1945, and sunk by US aircraft halfway through February, about 3 weeks later. 2 other ships, Shimane Maru and Otakisan Maru, were also converted and launched, although only the former would commission at the end of February 1945, before being sunk at the end of July without having been operationally deployed, whilst her sister drifted into an aerial-laid mine while she was fitting out and also sank. These ships all had small hangars with a notional air complement of 8 to 12 aircraft and a speed of 18 to 20 knots, thus being broadly comparable with the first generation of Allied escort carriers. But a lack of fuel, pilots and suitable aircraft kept them all from accomplishing anything of note. So, with all this expertise and amphibious assault shipping, why were so many Japanese landings unsuccessful or even outright disasters? Well, there was a whole mixture of reasons. Part of it was that, whilst very capable, there weren't that many major assault transports, and between their scarcity, their limited speed, and other factors, many of the frontline assaults simply took place without them. The assault on Wake Island, for example, only took a pair of normal troop transports along with the regular Imperial Japanese Navy contingent, and the fact that this was also a purely Navy operation precluded the use of the much more capable Army assets. Additionally, whilst the Imperial Japanese Army had extensive experience in moving troops overseas, thanks to the latest edition of the Sino-Japanese War that had been going on in the 1930s, that conflict hadn't offered massive amounts of opposed landings under heavy fire on a scale that the Allies would be able to offer, or encounter, over the course of World War II. which left a lot of pre-war experience somewhat obsolete. After all, a 57mm gun on a bulletproof gunboat was fine if you needed to pick off machine gun nests and maybe the odd improvised shore battery made from a piece of towed field artillery, but it was a less useful combination when you were facing off against fortified positions and 4, 5 or 6-inch guns, or potentially even larger weapons that might be around in significant numbers and were potentially also on islands and coastal regions that were much more open ocean than some of the littorals of China. Another aspect was timing. As you'll probably have noticed, much of the pre-war fleet could land men, maybe the odd light tank, but it was all out of ideas for anything heavier unless those first units could capture a quay or pier to unload vehicles from the larger assault ships. Whilst landing craft for heavier vehicles were made, like the SS type or the Type 101, by the time they were actually available in any great numbers, the big wave of Japanese offensives had pretty much stopped, and defensive operations were the order of the day. This combined with the antagonism between the Japanese Army and Japanese Navy to figuratively torpedo many of the Japanese Army's efforts, when Megami wasn't taking that phrase somewhat more literally, since it meant that the availability of ships with heavy guns for shore bombardment was rare, and the ships themselves most often were not actually trained in close support or any other kind of bombardment mission against enemy shore targets, something that would come back to bite the Japanese Navy in its own operations, such as attempts to suppress Henderson Field. Likewise, whilst the Japanese Army had its own air force, unless a nearby airstrip on an already captured island was available already, these aircraft would be fairly useless for the initial assault. They'd be out of range. And the carrier-based aircraft of the Imperial Japanese Navy were again often off doing their own thing. Thus, despite having landing craft, assault ships, etc., all well in advance of everyone else, when you think of an amphibious landing that works, you think of battleships, cruisers and destroyers offshore providing gunfire support, waves of aircraft keeping enemy warplanes away and targeting enemy troops on the ground, large landing craft hitting the beach with armoured support, all in aid of the infantry who were trying to take the ground itself. Whereas for the Imperial Japanese Army, it was generally just the infantry trying to take the ground, with maybe some light tanks if they were lucky, and possibly some begrudging support from an Imperial Japanese Navy who didn't especially want to be there and didn't know quite how to work with their army colleagues anyway. And that was when the Japanese Army actually wanted to undertake a landing. Remember that most of the Pacific War's expansion of Japanese territory was in exactly the opposite direction to the one that the Imperial Japanese Army itself thought that Japan should go, and with the Sino-Japanese War ongoing, where they diverted a lot of their own resources. Of course, once these weaknesses were identified, as we've seen, the Imperial Japanese Army did try to come up with solutions. But by that point, they were short on time and stuck in a war where a limited number of resources had to go an extremely long way, and the tide of war meant that many of these new designs were of somewhat lesser priority than simply trying to work out how to support and supply the areas they already held and were shortly to start losing. And that wraps us up for this relatively short Wednesday video, looking at some of the Imperial Japanese Army's fleet, why they had it, and what they tried to use it for, and unsurprisingly, how much of it ended up at the bottom of the ocean. I'm trying a slightly different set of audio balances this time, so let me know if that's helped any, and see you again in another video.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.